Oh, welcome to this evening's program, Big Apple's Big Business, How Washington Became the Apple State, a presentation by Amanda Van Lanen, brought to you by the North Olympic Library System and Humanities Washington. We begin by acknowledging that the lands on which we live and gather are the appropriated homelands of Indigenous peoples. We want to express our deepest respect to those peoples, past and present, for their care of these lands throughout the generations. The North Olympic Library System serves all of Clallam County, with locations in Clallam Bay, Forks, Port Angeles, and Sequim, and the Knowles Bookmobile. To learn more about what is happening at your library, please visit our website at knowles.org. This evening's presentation is part of Humanities Washington's Speakers Bureau program. Humanities Washington is a nonprofit organization dedicated to sparking conversation and critical thinking. They bring cultural programs to hundreds of thousands of people throughout the state of Washington each year, thanks to support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Washington Secretary of State, the Thomas S. Foley Institute for Public Policy and Public Service at Washington State University, and generous private donors. The Speakers Bureau program is designed to generate open and honest conversation. The intention is for this program to be a safe and inclusive space where differing perspectives and viewpoints are encouraged and shared in a respectful manner. You can find information about other events like this one on the Humanities Washington website at www.humanities.org. After this presentation, you will receive an email with a link to a brief evaluation from Humanities Washington. Please consider taking a few moments to complete the evaluation to support Humanities Washington's efforts to continually improve their Speakers Bureau programs.
In this time period.
We are very happy to have Amanda Van Lanen here with us this evening to talk about how Washington became the Apple State. Amanda is a professor of history at Lewis Clark State College and the author of The Washington Apple: Orchards and the Development of Industrial Agriculture. She earned a PhD in history at Washington State University and blogs about food history at historyreheated.com. Amanda, welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me. Before we get started, I did just want to ask, how do you want to handle questions this evening?
We do have a chat available. If you'd like, I can keep track of them, or if you'd rather have us hold them till the end, we could do that too.
Okay, I like having questions while I'm talking. So if folks are okay with that, then I will have Leslie help me monitor questions and help flag me down if there's something that pops up. Is everyone seeing my screen okay? Is it looking good, Leslie?
That looks great.
Okay, perfect. So thank you for that introduction. My name is Amanda Van Lanen, and I got interested in this topic in part because my parents were missionaries, and when I was a kid, we didn't live in a place where apples grew. And now my grandma grew up in the Northwest and worked in orchards, but being a missionary kid, we just didn't have access to things like apples all the time. We had a mango tree in our front yard, which I thought was fantastic. Just go out and pick mangoes. So the only apples that I ever had growing up were grocery store apples. And I'm sure many of you have had this experience of those shiny red, delicious apples that are in the grocery store, and you take one bite into them and they're mushy and mealy and the skins are bitter, and it's just not a pleasant experience. So when I would hear the adults in my life wax nostalgic about all these wonderful apples in the fall, I just didn't get it because my experience with apples was that. On the other hand, the fact that we lived in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and had apples in our little local island grocery store all year round is in itself a pretty remarkable thing. So that got me interested in thinking about this. How did this happen? How did these Washington Red Delicious apples come to take over the country and take over the globe? And I do say when I finally moved back to Washington when I was an adult and finally did have an apple out of an orchard fresh in season, I got it. They are delicious and they are fantastic. but quite a disconnect from the grocery store apples that a lot of people do experience. So I want to talk a little bit tonight about how apples got to the Northwest and how the apple industry developed into what we have today. Now, I talk a lot more about these things in my book, which is available online. So again, if you have questions, feel free to put it in the chat because I'm happy to go in different directions if folks are curious about things. Apples are a big business in Washington. They are the top agricultural commodity in the state, bigger than wheat, bigger than cattle, bigger than potatoes. This is a huge industry. And when I talk to people, especially back east, they kind of have this conception that Washington is very green, the evergreen state. I know those of you living on the Olympic Peninsula, it is very green. You get a lot more rain than we get out here in Eastern Washington. Um, but what most people don't realize is back east is that a lot of the apples are grown east of the Cascades. And so it's a very arid place. And so we'll talk about that too, because it's not necessarily intuitive that an apple industry would develop in Eastern Washington, Central Washington, in a place that is so dry. Throw your guess in the chat. What percentage of the nation's apples do you think Washington grows? A little audience participation here. 90%. 90% is a great guess. Um, it's actually 70%, which is still a lot. That is a lot of apples for Washington to grow, more than any other state. And Washington has been the leading producer of apples in the United States since the 1920s. So for 100 years now, Washington has dominated this industry. Now, to understand how this happened, we have to go back in time a little bit. Apples were part of all Americans' lives. And in the 19th century, most Americans still lived on farms. When American colonists first came to this continent, they brought apples with them. Apples were a part of home. They were something that folks relied on as a food source. And so when folks came from Europe, they brought apples with them. So I got a question in the chat, where else were apples grown? Well, they're grown everywhere. Everywhere European settlers went in North America, they planted apples and they grew apples. Now, apples are highly genetically variable. They're heterozygous, which means that the seeds that you plant are not going to turn out like the parent plant because there's so much genetic variability. So you might get seeds from a red apple and plant them and end up with an apple that produces a tree that produces fruit that's a different color or a different size or a different flavor. And so what this leads to is literally thousands of different varieties of apples being developed because you're throwing this genetic dice and you never know what you're going to get. When folks would get an apple that they thought was really good, what they would then have to do is basically clone it and use a scion to cut off to, sorry, my brain is not working right now, to graft it. They would have to graft it onto a new rootstock. And then that would essentially clone the apple. And then you could propagate that apple that you liked the flavor or the color or whatever properties it had. So every farm had their own orchard. Every farm used the apples in a variety of ways. Most families would have a tree that was like their good eating tree. They would also have larger orchards that they would just plant with seeds and let anything come up. And those are the trees that would get used for making apple cider, or they would let their hogs run loose. So apples are really part of American life. And as American settlers moved west, they took trees with them. Now, you all may be familiar with Johnny Appleseed. Many of you may have seen the Disney cartoon when you were kids of Johnny Appleseed with his tin pan hat going around giving apple seeds to settlers. Johnny Appleseed was a real person. His name was John Chapman. He was born in Pennsylvania, and he went to what was then the Northwest Territory in Ohio and Indiana in the early 1800s. And he wasn't just this itinerant preacher passing out apple seeds. He was actually a nurseryman. He owned land and he owned several nurseries. Now, these nurseries were very important for the settlement of the West because you needed to plant trees to prove land ownership. So in the old Northwest Territory, you had to plant 50 apple trees to prove your ownership of the land. And those trees were visible symbols of the fact that you had been there for a number of years. Apples take 3 to 5 years before they start producing fruit. And so you could literally point to your apple trees and say, I planted these, see how big they are. That's how long I've been on this piece of land. And that helped prove your ownership. So nurserymen like Johnny Appleseed were really important because think of the advantage if you don't have to plant a tree from seed. If you can kind of skip ahead a little bit and get a sapling that's already established, that's going to make claiming your land a lot easier. And so nurserymen were in high demand, the trees were in high demand. Even apple seeds were in high demand because everyone needed to plant their trees. And in the early years, they were hard to get. So this, again, trees are very important culturally for food, but also for this purpose of land ownership. Now, as Americans keep moving west, as I said, they keep bringing their fruit with them. The very first apple tree in Washington was planted at Fort Vancouver. Fort Vancouver was an outpost of the Hudson's Bay Trading Company. And the factor in the 1820s was a guy named John McLaughlin. Hudson's Bay Company had a problem. They had to feed all their fur trappers. And the fur trappers did not like the native foods of the Pacific Northwest. They didn't like salmon. They didn't want what was available. And the company was spending an enormous amount of money shipping flour around the Cape on ships all the way to Fort Vancouver. It's incredibly expensive. One winter, the employees butchered 600 horses to eat over the winter. Also incredibly expensive. And so McLaughlin knows this is not sustainable and wants to come up with a better solution. Now, at one of their outposts in Minnesota, the Hudson's Bay Company had started an experimental farm, and it was working quite well. So McLaughlin says, let's try this. Let's try growing some of our own foods so we can save the company some money. And so he sends away to the London Horticultural Society for all kinds of seeds, different types of grain, forage, fodder crops for animals, fruit, vegetables. Let's just try everything and see if it grows. And his gardens were incredibly successful. Now, the story of how the first apple tree gets to Fort Vancouver is a very romantic story. I'm not sure if it's true, but it's a great story anyway, so I'm going to tell it. There was a young gentleman. He was an officer. He was getting ready to leave London and they had a farewell dinner in his honor. And as was very common at the time, fruit was served as a final course at the dinner. And a young lady sitting next to him saved her apple seeds, wrapped them up neatly in her handkerchief, and tucked them in the breast pocket of his coat and said, "Remember me when you get to North America." So he gets to Fort Vancouver, puts on his jacket, and realizes he has these seeds, and they plant them. And that becomes the first apple tree at Fort Vancouver. It's a great story. It's very romantic. It was repeated, in fact, very early. Narcissa Whitman mentions this in her diary in the 1830s. So the story was circulating quite early. We also know that McLaughlin sent off to London for seeds. So I'm not sure what's true or what's not, but it's still a beautiful story. And that very first apple tree in Fort Vancouver lived until the summer of 2020. So it lasted a very long time. For McLaughlin, this was a great success. It helped provide food for his men, but in a much larger sense, this helped drive American settlement to the Willamette Valley and to the Northwest. because when missionaries start coming, the Whitmans and the Spaldings and the Lees and all those first missionaries in the Northwest, they come and they stay at Fort Vancouver and they see these fabulous farms and they write about them and they tell their friends back in the US, hey, this is great farming country. McLaughlin was very generous with his seeds. He gave apple seeds to Marcus Whitman and Henry Spalding. Those seeds were planted in Walla Walla and at the Spaldings Mission in Lapwai, Idaho. And the Spaldings also shared seeds with the Nez Perce, who also planted orchards. So these are some of the first orchards in the Northwest. Now, this is still pretty small time stuff, but the Oregon Trail picks up and more Americans start moving west. Again, still with that demand for trees. Now, these trees up to this point were all grown from seed. The very first varieties that we know of that were grafted trees were brought by Henderson Lewing. Now, Henderson Lewing was from a long line of nurserymen. His brothers, his father, other family members had owned nurseries, first in North Carolina and then in Iowa. And when Henderson Lewing decided to move to the Oregon Territory, he brought 2 wagon loads of trees with him, about 700 different trees in total. Now, these weren't all apple trees. He brought a whole variety of fruit. We don't know exactly what those wagon boxes looked like, but this is one artist rendering of what they might have looked like. We do have descriptions of these big open boxes that he built that he planted the trees in. Now, folks thought Henderson Lewing was a little bit crazy. Folks kept telling him, you're never going to get your trees across the Rockies. It's going to freeze. You're going to lose everything. This is nuts. And in fact, he ran into another gentleman, William Barlow, who had attempted the same thing a few years earlier and chickened out and turned back. But Lewin wasn't deterred. He took both wagon loads of trees over the Rockies. He lost a few, but most of his trees survived. And as he neared the end of the Oregon Trail, he was met by Marcus Whitman. This is 1847. And at this point, Marcus Whitman was spending a lot of time guiding wagon trains over the Blue Mountains. Marcus Whitman tried to get Henderson Lewing to divert to Walla Walla and plant his trees there. Lewing decided instead to head on to his original destination in the Willamette Valley, wisely in retrospect, because later that year the Whitmans would be killed. But for Lewing, he establishes a nursery. His brothers join him, and their trees and their fruit are in high demand. Now, Lewing gets to Oregon in 1847. 2 years later, the gold rush starts in California. And by the time the gold rush is in full swing, the Lewing brothers have fruit to sell. They get the bright idea, let's box up some of this fruit and ship it down to California and sell it to the miners. So in 1853, they send 2 big crates of fruit bound with iron straps so that no one can steal it to Sacramento. That fruit sells in Sacramento for $80 a pound in today's dollars. Miners were desperate for anything fresh, and they went like crazy. So for a few years there, folks in the Oregon Territory are quite excited about this very lucrative market that they can ship extra apples down to California and make bank. Of course, laws of supply and demand, as more people start shipping apples from Oregon to California, the prices drop. It doesn't stay $80 a pound forever. And after a year or two of this, Henderson Lewing gets wise and decides that maybe instead of shipping my apples to California, I should just plant some apple orchards in California, and then I would be closer to my market. So Lewing started some of the first commercial apple orchards in California. So we have this brief time where apple growing in Oregon at least seems like it's going to be a big commercial enterprise. But eventually, apple production starts in California, and it's not economically feasible to keep shipping apples that far. We see a lot of booms and busts in the 19th century. Mining claims will start in an area, and folks will develop orchards to help feed the miners, and that will last for a little while, and then it will finally die out. So we kind of get these small regional bursts of economic activity. Which brings us back to our question of why Washington. Apples were grown everywhere. In the late 19th century, the biggest commercial district in the nation was New York. New York's commercial orchards date back to the Civil War. These are well-established orchards. They are producing large amounts of apples commercially, and they are very close to population on the East Coast. They're right near New York City and Philadelphia and Boston. It's very easy for them to get fresh fruit to market. There's also substantial commercial apple orchards in places like Virginia and North Carolina, Michigan, and the Ozarks. There's also a lot of smaller regional orchards in places like California that are serving the regional market. Washington is far away from everything else in the United States. Transportation costs alone make Washington apples more expensive than apples grown in other places. And as I have here highlighted on this map, the main commercial districts that develop in Washington, the Wenatchee, Okanogan, and the Yakima Valley are the two largest, immediately in the rain shadow of the Cascades, in a place that gets 7 to 10 inches of rain a year. This is a desert. It makes no sense. So this is what really got me started in my research. How did these things come together for Washington to become the powerhouse that it did when apples were already being grown everywhere else? Well, there's a convergence of factors that happened. The biggest was that the railroads arrived in Washington. And the railroads had offices looking at land all along their lines. If you look at a Western industry, you're going to find a railroad behind it somewhere because they had their fingers in everything. Now, the US government gave land grants to several of the railroads to help them finance construction. So railroads have an interest in selling land and recouping that cost. And so they were looking up and down their whole territory, trying to figure out what is the best economic use for each area. Because not only are they going to make money from land sales, they're going to make money from hauling a product. So where are the areas where we can emphasize logging? Where's the good wheat growing country? Where's the area that's good for cattle ranching? And actively promoting those industries in each area. As they're looking at Central Washington, what is it good for? Well, it turns out that the soil in Central Washington is incredibly fertile if you water it. The problem is that irrigation systems are very expensive. And so if you're going to put in irrigation, you really need to grow a crop that's going to get a high return. Well, sure, there's a lot of fruits and vegetables. The problem is a lot of them are quite perishable. And in the early 1900s, when all of this is being developed, there's not the technology, there's not the refrigeration technology quite yet to preserve fresh fruits and vegetables. Apples, though, apples are a little different. There was good enough refrigeration technology to ship apples across the country. And so that is the crop that the railroads kind of landed on to promote in Central Washington. Now, again, this doesn't always seem to make a lot of sense. Irrigation is expensive. Washington is a small state. Apples are grown everywhere. It's not like there's a big market for a huge influx of apples locally, which means that from the beginning, they knew they were going to have to ship the crop other places in the country. So you add irrigation, you add the cost of transportation. A Washington apple cost 3 times as much as an apple grown in New York. So we're setting ourselves up for an industry where we know we can't sell them locally. We're going to have to ship them back east, but they're going to be 3 times as expensive. So how do we convince people to pay 3 times as much for these apples when we're in an already very crowded market? Well, Washington growers had a little bit of luck at the beginning because there was huge crop failure in the Ozarks in the early 1900s. And so that gave Washington growers a little bit of an opening. For a few years there, buyers came from the Midwest to Washington to purchase whatever apples Washington was growing because of that crop damage. But that didn't last. So building this up took a lot of effort. We'll talk about those factors in a few moments, but I just want to give you a sense of how quickly and how big the Washington apple industry grew despite these limitations. So this is from a Washington State Horticultural Report in 1916. Here's your county, Clallam County, 24,000 apple trees. That's a lot of apple trees. Pretty significant amount. This is where I live in Asotin County on the opposite corner of the state. And folks around here are very proud of our orchard heritage. And that's also a lot of apples. I can't even picture what that looks like because that's just so many trees. But when we compare that to the economic and agricultural growth of central Washington, here's Okanogan County and Chelan County. This is the Wenatchee Okanogan region, and these are often combined when the state was looking at statistics. And then there's Yakima County. That is a lot of trees. So again, folks are entering into this knowing this is going to be commercial production and going into this with a plan and going into this knowing that they're going to have to sell these apples somewhere besides Washington State. So the railroads are a big piece of this, promoting the land, getting people to move out here and plant orchards. Now, the railroads ran all kinds of different advertisements. This is one of my favorite because you can literally see the miles of apples. That, this is the land of money, right? The whole marketing premise to get people to move out here and plant these apples in the first place was that this is easy money. You can make a fortune coming out to Washington and planting apples. A lot of these ads were targeted at folks who were already middle class, school teachers, lawyers, small business owners. Are you tired of the rat race of life back east? Come out to Washington, start an orchard, piece of cake, you'll make money in no time. It wasn't just the railroads, it was also local towns that tried to promote land sales. This is one of my favorites that I ever found. This is from Granger in the Yakima Valley, literally picking gold off trees. And this is what people were told. This is a lucrative industry. You're going to make a ton of money. It doesn't take any know-how, or that much work. Unfortunately, for many of these people who came out, they didn't have much agricultural experience. And so I don't know about you all, but if I had to run a farm, I'm a historian, I wouldn't know the first thing to do, and it would probably be an utter failure. And that's exactly what a lot of the first settlers in central Washington experienced. They didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know how to manage the agricultural systems. They didn't know how to deal with all the problems that come with growing fruit. And so the railroads have set people up for this, and it's not panning out as planned. So what happens very early on is that the state recognizes that this is a major industry. And so from very early on, the state imposes a lot of rules to make sure that fruit growing is going to be successful. If we're going to sell fruit and we're going to charge a lot of money for it, it better be perfect, because that's the only way we're going to get people to pay a higher price and make this industry work. And so one of the big problems that growers faced early on was bugs, wormy apples. There's no way you're going to get someone to pay 3 times as much for an apple that looks like this. Got to find a way to get rid of the pests. Um, Codling moth was the biggest problem. Codling moths can lay up to 4 rounds of eggs on a tree over the course of a growing season. And they lay their eggs on the tree, and then the worms hatch and burrow into the apples. So, one of the early horticultural laws in Washington was that you had to spray your trees. Because if you don't spray your trees, then you could potentially infect your neighbor, and that's going to affect everyone. Now, they didn't know what to kill these critters with. And so people tried everything. The state colleges worked on this problem, testing different formulas and testing different pesticides. I saw accounts where people tried sour milk or whale oil or just different combinations of household products that they could put together to try to see if they could kill the calling moth. Ultimately, it turned out the thing that worked was lead arsenate, which is a compound of lead and arsenic and is fairly toxic. It would kill the moths, though. So, this is what everyone sprayed on their orchards. Now, people often ask me, like, they're not wearing any safety gear, they're not wearing masks. All the historical accounts that I came across where people do mention masks, the thing that they always say was, it is too hot. It was too hot. You know, they told me I should wear a mask, but I couldn't breathe. And so I just took it off after a while. And I've met plenty of people from Central Washington who said their, grandparents worked in the orchards and sprayed and didn't think it was a big deal. They just changed their clothes at the end of the day, and that's what everyone did, because this is what you have to do if you're going to create a perfect apple to be able to be successful economically. Now, we think of nice shiny red apples. Lead arsenic leaves kind of a grayish white film on the fruit. So the orchards don't look very pretty after all this has been sprayed. And as you can imagine, consumers know that lead and arsenic are not good for you. And this did become a problem in the mid 1920s in particular. Now, the United States never had any regulations on the amount of arsenic that could be in food products, but Great Britain did. And about 20% of Washington apples were exported to Great Britain. And in 1925, British grocers started finding apples that had hundreds of times in excess of what British regulations allowed. And so this became a huge scandal. People finding these apples with arsenic on them. Now, at first, growers denied that there was a problem. The argument was that, it would rain and it would wash the arsenic off the apples. Of course, it doesn't rain in Central Washington in the summer, so that excuse didn't work for very long. Part of the problem was that Britain threatened to ban the import of American apples. And so growers had to figure out how to fix this problem, because that was a significant part of the market. Not to mention the fact that these headlines are showing up in American papers and potentially driving people away from eating apples in the United States. So what they came up with was this system of brush washers to kind of clean up the apples and wipe off the excess pesticides. They would also wash them in a mild hydrochloric acid to help loosen up any residues that were still remaining on the fruit, so that, again, we can keep using these pesticides to grow apples that do not have worms in them. Growers are really in a spot because, again, they have to sell perfect apples if they're going to get the high price that they want. And there's no way to do that without the pesticides. So it's a little bit of a dilemma. The other thing growers had to decide was what varieties to plant. There are thousands of varieties of apples. and you want to have something that's successful in the market and something that consumers are going to want to purchase. Again, you're competing in a very saturated market with apples that are much, much cheaper than the ones you're growing. So very early on, the thing that growers selected for were apples that could travel well and that could stand up to shipment. Ben Davis was one variety that was very popular in the early years. And every farmer I came across that talked about Ben Davis apples said that they didn't eat them themselves. They didn't like how they tasted. But Ben Davis had a nice thick skin and they traveled well. So they grew Ben Davis to sell and ate other things themselves. Um, but that's a trend that we see. What are consumers going to buy? What color of apples do consumers have preference for? One of the things they found was that consumers liked apples that were all one color. So very early on, there were a lot of apples being grown commercially, like the winter banana. It's a beautiful apple. It's kind of yellow and it's got these pink and red kind of blushy streaks coming down from the top. Consumers didn't like that. They wanted apples that were all one color, and that is partly why growers started planting the Red Delicious variety because the shape was very appealing to consumers and it had that nice deep red uniform color that sold very well in the market. Packing was also very important. This is another way that Washington was able to kind of distinguish itself from other apples on the market. Back east, apples were packed in barrels, and we didn't do that out west, partly because we didn't have the hardwoods, and partly because barrels don't pack as well in a rail car. But in the early 1900s, the advice for packing an apple barrel was to pack it as full of apples as you could and to squeeze them in until you saw juice running out the bottom of the barrel, and then to nail the lid on. So if you can imagine consumers back in an eastern city, they're used to purchasing out of an apple barrel where the apples might be bruised or a bit mangled or a bit sticky from some of that apple juice, and you're just pulling them out of a barrel. Washington growers spent the time to size the apples so that all of the apples in the box were a uniform size, and every apple got wrapped in paper, packaged very carefully, and put in a nice apple box. So even though these two apples could be basically identical, you can see how maybe the consumer might pay more for the Washington apple because it's not bruised and it's not sticky and it's not wormy and it doesn't have any of those other things happening that might be happening with the New York apple. Now, New York growers at first really took Washington for granted. Um, Growers back east did not think that Western apples tasted very well. They thought because we irrigated, our apples weren't as good. They didn't see Western growers as a threat because it's an apple. Why would someone pay that much money for an apple? They just didn't see this as being viable at all. And New York was the number one apple producing state until Washington surpassed it in the 1920s. And growers in New York didn't start paying attention to Washington until quite late in the game because they didn't see this as being legitimate competition. In fact, I came across accounts of New York growers who thought this whole thing of wrapping apples in paper and boxing them was just bogus. One guy that I came across, he was like, well, yeah, I tried that too. I tried this experiment and I tried packing some of my apples in boxes. And yeah, I got more money for them, but it's just a gimmick. It's just silly. Why bother when you can just put them in a barrel? So those growers in New York are very, very kind of late to realize the marketing benefit of this. And that helps give Washington apples an edge with consumers. The other thing that New York growers are very late to the game on is using pesticides. They started growing fruit in an era where consumers were used to getting wormy apples, and that was just part of life. And so they were very skeptical of the use of things like pesticides or fungicides to control the orchard because they had just never done it. And they didn't think that it was really anything that would add value to their crops. So, again, by the time they start adopting some of these newer scientific methods of agriculture, Washington has already kind of stepped into the breach with our beautiful, shiny, non-wormy apples, and have really started to appeal to consumers that way. Of course, the other thing that Washington growers do is we advertise. And this is something very early on people realize we need to do because, again, apples grow everywhere. We don't have available local markets, and we are charging a premium for this product. So the Apple label was kind of the front line of where people would advertise. We've got these beautiful boxes of beautifully wrapped apples and all of that real estate on a box for a colorful label to attract someone's eye to the product that they're buying. This is an era in the early 1900s where printing is becoming much, much cheaper. And so it's affordable to be able to purchase these kind of very colorful and well-designed labels. But growers don't stop there. Many growers end up joining marketing cooperatives to fund targeted advertising campaigns to Eastern consumers. And these are campaigns that would look maybe very familiar to those of us in the 21st century. A lot of them feature mascots. Perhaps the best known of the mascots is the Skookum Indian that was a mascot of the Northwest Fruit Exchange. It made its debut in 1916. And this was used for all kinds of promotional products. This is an advertisement from a Good Housekeeping magazine in 1921. They would advertise in magazines, newspapers, billboards. You could mail in for a Skookum doll or a Skookum coloring book or a Skookum cookbook. All of these premiums to kind of put the brand out there and associate that with apples. Now, at one point, there were over 200 brands coming out of Washington because there were some of these, like the Skookum Indian, that were larger organizations, but there were also mom and pop outfits and other competing cooperatives. Blue Goose, Big Y, and Blue Ribbon were kind of the other big three, along with Skookum. In the 1920s, the Northern Pacific did a survey asking consumers if they could name any apple brands. And perhaps not surprisingly, most consumers are like, I don't know what apples I buy. I just buy the red ones. But 15% of consumers could name the Skookum Indian. And that's, I think, pretty telling when you're in a market with over 200 Washington brands that many consumers could at least name one and remember that and associate that with Washington. Again, New York growers in other part of the country are much slower to pick up on this and to pick up on these advertising techniques. And so that gives Washington growers an in and a way to kind of build the consumer market and consumer loyalty and get people to buy their apples. Early on, they tried a lot of other marketing gimmicks. One of the big ones was the National Apple Show that first debuted in 1908. And this was done in Spokane. And the whole idea was to bring national attention to Washington apples. And this is an era where fairs and exhibitions are a very big deal. People come out to them for entertainment and for education. This was pretty short-lived, partly because there were really strong regional rivalries in Washington surrounding the apple growing districts. Spokane was trying to position itself as the center of the apple industry, but Wenatchee and Yakima were much bigger producers and they weren't having it. So what I have here is a picture of the biggest prize, the carload exhibition. This is 630 boxes of apples, the number of apples that would fit on a rail car. And at the National Apple Show, this was kind of the grand prize that everyone came out to see. But you could exhibit everything from a full boxcar down to a plate with 3 apples on it. So really something for everyone to display whatever you're growing. This is the carload from H.M. Gilbert's farm in North Yakima. The Gilbert family is actually still farming today. They still own orchards. Folks in Yakima were sure that Gilbert was going to win. But Yakima lost the prize to Mike Horan of Wenatchee. Now, this created a huge uproar because Gilbert had packed his car just like anyone would pack any other car for shipment. He used his regular picking crew. He just had them do it like he normally would. Mike Horan hired a crack team of pickers, and they spent 3 months preparing the apples for the exhibit. Now, there's nothing in the rules saying they couldn't do that, but Yakima cried foul. And all the National Apple Show really did was kind of highlight these differences, highlight the tensions between these regions as both Yakima and Wenatchee were trying to position themselves as the apple capital, not only of Washington State, but of the nation. What worked much better was National Apple Week. This was an event put together by the International Apple Shippers Association, and it really started taking off in the 1920s when it was extended from Apple Day to Apple Week, culminating on Halloween, which was kind of seen as a good time for apple bobbing and fall celebration. National Apple Week was left up to individual locations. All the International Apple Shippers Association did was kind of compile a list of events and say, here are some things you could do. Here are some things people have done to celebrate. Take the ideas that you want and go out and have a great time. So it was really common to see cities do window displays, contests, that kind of thing to celebrate National Apple Week. The railroads did get involved with this, and they did help the apple industry advertise. One of the things they would do during National Apple Week was feature apples on their dining cars. So for the Northern Pacific Railroad, the big baked potato was kind of their signature dish, promoting potato growers in Idaho. And you can see that little girl there in the picture with her great big baked potato. During Apple Week, they would serve a great big baked apple to kind of mirror the signature dish. Again, trying to promote apples and trying to promote the territory on their rail line where those apples were grown. My favorite National Apple Week event happened in Yakima in 1927. This was right after the big arsenic scare, and folks weren't even sure that they were going to celebrate National Apple Week in the wake of that arsenic scare and the threat of having American exports banned. But they decided they wanted to do something really big and really special. So the town planners first thought, hey, maybe we'll do a big apple cake. But that just didn't seem right. Got to do apple pie. Nothing as American as apple pie. So the whole town got together. The local hardware store donated materials to build this specially constructed pie plate that was 10 feet in diameter. They had to specially construct the knife and the oven that they baked it in. The local Libby McNeil cannery pre-cooked 450 gallons of apples to put in this thing because they knew on the day of the event they wanted to actually bake the pie, but there was no way the apples would cook if they weren't already cooked. On the day of the event, they had girls from the local home economics class come out with these very long rolling pins to prepare the crust and bake this while the newsreels were running. It was a hugely popular event. It got a lot of press and it just seems like a lot of fun. So this is the kind of thing that folks were doing to celebrate and help advertise the apple in the early days. Eventually, the state will legislate of the Washington State Apple Commission, and that will happen in 1937 during the Depression. And all growers in the state contributed to this fund for a statewide advertising campaign for all Washington apples, that again targeted magazines and newspapers, radio programs, eventually television advertisements to encourage people to eat Washington apples. So it's really this combination of things. The railroads, the support for irrigation, um, everything coming together for Washington growers to create this apple that wasn't wormy, that looked nicer than competing apples, and convincing consumers that that kind of fresh, beautiful produce was healthier and that that's what they should be spending their money on. Now, there were a lot of complaints about that at the time. I ran across an article from a local produce journal where the guy was complaining about all this fresh West Coast produce because it wasn't just Washington apples. At this time, California is shipping oranges and lettuce, and we're getting this influx of fresh things. People in cities weren't used to that. They weren't used to having a kind of this affordable fresh produce. And in this magazine, this guy was just complaining, like, man, what is with people? They want fresh stuff that looks pretty. Like, man, for the days when we could go back to just selling, shriveled up turnips in March and people were fine with it. Which I just thought was kind of funny because, of course, why wouldn't people want fresh produce? Why wouldn't they want something that looked beautiful and hopefully tasted beautiful, especially in an era where folks didn't always have those options, right? Where you were perhaps stuck in March buying a shriveled up turnip or buying a kind of bruised, wormy apple from a big apple barrel. Why wouldn't you want that beautiful Washington apple wrapped in paper? Of course, we know that's much more complicated now. The pesticides that go into it, the distance the apples had to travel, the use of water, all of these things, the conformity of everything having to be the same. Today, we have a different view and different values, perhaps, of food, and don't value all of those things in the same way that consumers did 100 years ago when Washington became the preeminent apple state. But I think it's something for us to think about and to think about where we came and where we've been and how much things have changed. Do folks have questions? I feel like I've been talking for a very long time now. I see a hand raised. I see, when is it?
Yes, my name is Wynn. And I have to say, because I've heard this before from people of your generation, not to say your generation, but people don't understand that red delicious apples didn't used to taste like they do now.
No, they didn't.
Back in the 60s, when I first tasted one as a very little kid, I remember cracking it. You know how a really crisp apple, when you bite into it, you can crack it?
Yeah.
Crisp they were, and they tasted divine. So I had a Red Delicious a couple of years ago because I hadn't had one for decades, and I tasted it's like mushy, tasteless. Oh my heavens, what did they do to the Red Delicious apples? So I just had to put in a word in defense.
I have heard other people tell me that, and I wish I could have a good one. I've never tasted a good one. Um, but part of what's happened is, since the 60s, they're using that controlled atmosphere storage. And so they can keep them in storage for up to a full year. And I suspect that a lot of consumers are getting apples that are not exactly fresh.
Okay, and just to put in there, I was recently, within the last year, turned on to Cosmic Crisp apples. The first time I bit into one of those, it was like the same reaction I had with the Red Delicious back in the 60s. So just to give you that, there are some really great apples out there. Red Delicious is not on my program anymore.
No, unfortunately not. Yeah, the Cosmic Crisps are great. The Honey Crisps are great. I'm excited to see this new variety that WSU is having the naming contest for to see how that compares. I got a question in the chat. Why did early settlers need to plant 50 apple trees and not other fruit trees? A lot of that is just cultural, and there were other fruit trees being planted. Um, but a lot of those were kind of seen as being more for gentlemen, more for people who had farming as a hobby. Apples were really the workhorse of the farm because they were so versatile that you could, turn them into cider. Hard cider was really a big part of people's diet before Prohibition. Vinegar, you could dry them, you could bake them, you could feed your hogs. They really were a workhorse, and apples they last pretty well. And so other fruits just didn't quite have that same property that apples had. Now, pear trees were sometimes in the mix, and so in some jurisdictions you could plant apple or pear. And I think pear for the same reason as apple, it could kind of be more of a workhorse fruit for the orchard, where other types of fruit were seen more as more specialized, I guess is a word for it. Other questions? I always feel a little awkward in Zoom because I can't see faces. Which apples produce in the largest volume today? I would need to look that up. It's kind of been in flux recently. The Red Delicious were the top apple until about a decade ago. Now there's a lot of Fuji's, there's a lot of Honey Crisps. Um, but again, it's very much a situation in flux, and there are quite a few more varieties being grown commercially than there were 20 or 30 years ago, because everyone is trying to kind of keep up with consumer demand and give people options and put out the newest shiny variety that's going to get a lot of sales. Um, Baking. Boy, my husband and I did a taste test with apple pies last fall. We tried several varieties. I made apple pies like 6 weeks in a row. And we thought the Fuji's were the best, kind of gave the best pie. I like to throw in some Granny Smith and kind of do a little bit of a mix though. Um, because depending on how sweet you like your pies, most of the apples today are kind of grown for eating fresh, and they do tend to be a little bit sweeter than some of the older heirloom varieties that were more geared toward baking. Um, so I do like a Fuji with a little bit of a Granny Smith mix, I think makes a nice pie. Um, Internationally, that's a great question. I'm not sure if there's more. I know there are different tastes internationally, but I don't know the answer to that question. That's a great question though. Um, Granny Smith isn't being grown nearly as much. And again, that's because there's a lot of new varieties coming on the market. So partly what's happened in the last 10 or 15 years is there's a lot of what are called club varieties. And these are varieties that are patented and that are developed. And when someone buys those trees, they're having to basically pay a licensing fee for that variety. But then there's also a lot of marketing that goes into the branding of that particular apple. So one of the club varieties that I've seen recently in the grocery store are called Jazz. Um, I've seen opals. Opal's another one of those club varieties. Um, and those tend to cycle in and out because they're trying to make a big splashy thing. And so you see all these different kind of weird varieties popping up because trying to get consumers interested and get people to buy apples. Graham seeds do make great pies, but they are So hard to get. I see a hand, I see a face. Jean.
Hi there. Yes. Two things. The apples that we're growing in our backyard that I love for apple pie are the Melrose and a brown russet.
Ooh, I've
They're
never actually tasted either of those.
they're very rich, very rich. I think we got them from Burnt Ridge. So we live not too far from Onalaska, where there's some great nurseries. And yeah, so we're lucky that way.
Oh, that's
And
great.
the other thing I wanted to ask you about um, is in this process of getting rid of the really toxic pesticides, how much was the not master gardeners, but the land grant colleges, how much help did that provide for getting people off the pesticides?
Huge. And the land grant colleges have been huge. And in 1937, Washington also legislated a tree fruit research station that is still operating. And they're pretty much the big driver with the science behind um, agriculture between for the apple industry. So they used lead arsenate into the 1940s when they switched over to DDT. And at first, DDT kind of seemed like it was going to be this miracle pesticide. And as many of you probably know, it was not. And by the time DDT was phased out in the late 60s, it caused more problems than it solved because growers were finding it killed the codling moth, but then they had problem with spider mites and other pests that they hadn't had problems with before because of the ways in which DDT kind of threw the environment out of balance. And so since the 70s, the trend has been toward what's called integrated pest management, kind of thinking more holistically about everything in your environment. And so they still do use pesticides, but they work very closely with Washington State University, with the Tree Research Farm, um, to target things more directly, and to use the tool that they need more specifically rather than just kind of like in the old days, man. I read accounts of people spraying the orchards until the trees were just dripping, like literally dripping with pesticide. They don't do that anymore. Pesticides are expensive. So, and they are highly regulated, so they are much more selective about that. But they are also using things like the codling moth traps to trap the pheromone traps where they can trap the females. They've had a lot of success with that. And so there are things that have kind of been adopted industry wide that are gentler on the environment and cost effective that they are using, and they are still experimenting, trying to come up with ways to not have to use chemicals if they don't have to.
Thank you.
Yeah. Unfortunately, apples are one of the crops that always ends up on the environmental working group's dirty dozen list, because they do still use quite a few pesticides. So if that is a concern, buy organic. The other cool thing that they're doing is they're trying to breed trees that are more drought resistant and that are more specifically suited for our climate, because one of the big problems they've been having in recent years is that our summers have been so darn hot, that it's been too hot for some varieties. So that's where the Cosmic Crisp and this new apple that they're developing are really specifically geared for Central Washington, and they can handle the heat a little bit better, which means a healthier tree. But yeah, if you can get your hand on heirlooms, that's fantastic. There are so many varieties of apples out there. And if you have access to an orchard that's growing heirlooms, or if you have your own tree, or you've got friends with trees, that's fantastic. I want to say last time I looked at statistics, about 4% of apples grown in Washington are organic, and that number is growing. There is big demand among consumers for more organic produce. I mean, I think a few years ago when Walmart said they were going to start selling organic, it's like, yeah, that's going to be a big driver of the market, because when those big big chains say they want something, um, farmers respond. So I think we're going to see more organic production as time goes on, and Washington does lead the nation in organic apple production. And I would say as a consumer that it does matter. I mean, stores notice what we're purchasing. They we scan our loyalty cards and they track what we buy. So it does make a difference. Washington farmers, there are some subsidies, but in general, apple farmers or any fruit or vegetable growers don't get the same kind of subsidies that you see in the big commodity crops like wheat or soybeans, or legumes. So there are some subsidies, but not to the same amount. And I would have to look up specifically what those are. Migrant workers, that's a great question. Migrant workers in particular in the apple industry have been more since the 80s. Prior to the 80s, there were some, but there was also still a fairly large population of American fruit pickers, college kids who would come out and do it, folks who would kind of run the fruit circuit and move from Washington to California and back and do that. Until the 50s or 60s, Washington, picking apples was pretty good money. For example, I know a lot of my husband does research with railroads. He's interviewed a lot of railroaders, and he met quite a few guys that would take their 2-week vacation and come pick apples because it was just a good way to make extra money. So the workforce really up until about the 80s was predominantly white. Although I did have some growers tell me that there were Indians that would come over from reservations in Montana and that would pick. But really, really in the 80s is when we kind of see the shift to migrant workers. That's a great question. With other crops grown with apple trees at the base. So not anymore. But in the early years, especially when growers were waiting for trees to produce fruit, many of them did try growing other crops at the bottom. So, asparagus or alfalfa. Alfalfa was really common, planting alfalfa in between. It's a good nitrogen fixer, but then you can also use it to feed your cattle or your other livestock. There was a lot of debate in the early years over whether you should mix apples with another crop. And the biggest problem really was that a lot of the people buying orchards didn't know how to farm. So they weren't any good at farming apple trees. They certainly weren't any good at farming the second thing that they planted at the base of the trees. And then it just all turned into a big hot mess. So most of the experts recommended just sticking to apples and learning how to do the one thing really well rather than screwing up two things. The Columbia Basin, when did the Columbia Basin become a prominent apple growing region in Washington? That came a little bit later. The Columbia Basin project didn't really go fully online until the 1950s. So that region wasn't really getting irrigation water until quite a bit later. But once it did start becoming irrigated, we start to see in the 60s and 70s production moving into the Columbia Basin. And today, most of that production has moved into the Columbia Basin. A lot of the older orchards, particularly up in the Okanagan region, are not there any longer. Great question. And I don't know if anyone has driven across Washington State, but if you see those plantings in the Columbia Basin, they are very high density. So historically, growers planted about 40 apple trees per acre. today they have high density plantings on dwarf rootstocks where they get anywhere between 800 and 1,000 trees per acre. They line them up on trellises, kind of like grapevines, and pack them in there. So the irrigation for the Columbia Basin came from Grand Coulee after Grand Coulee was built, and off of Grand Coulee, and that was constructed during the Depression in the 1930s. But due to the war and other things happening in between, they didn't get the full irrigation system up and operational until the early 1950s. So some great questions. Thank you, Mary. I'm glad everyone was able to attend. I know that's a great question. Are apple trees affected by the decline in bee population? I haven't come across anything um, where I've seen that as a concern for commercial apple production. Um, I know they do bring out hives and do have, there's commercial beehives that they bring out and bring around to the orchards. But I haven't come across anything where I've seen that as a problem in the industry. I would have to look into that more. But that's a great question. Do I see any significant changes coming to the Washington apple industry in the next 10 years or so? I think one of the biggest changes, well, two changes actually. One of the biggest changes is climate. We are getting hotter summers, that is affecting the fruit, and so there there are, they are working on breeding trees that are going to be more resistant to drought. Um, we'll see what happens depending on how water situations line up. We've seen a lot more forest fires in recent years, and we'll see how that affects the industry. Um, Labor is increasingly an issue. Um, One of the things that they are working on that we may see within the next decade are robotic pickers. They've had some good success with a robotic picking system in the last few years. They've been doing test plots in New Zealand and in Washington. Um, and depending on cost, that could be something that we see. Apples are still harvested by hand, because you have to be very careful with them. You don't want them to bruise. You can't just like shake the tree like you can with some crops. So that might be a pretty significant change, if robotic pickers do start to come into the mix. So stay tuned. How long does it take from the time the apple's picked until we can buy it? That depends. If you're going to your local orchard, you can probably pick it and eat it the same day. If we're talking more commercial orchards, um, from the time it's picked until the time it winds up in a grocery store could be anywhere from a few weeks to several months. They can keep apples in cold storage in controlled atmosphere storage for up to a year. So we're pretty lucky, I think, here in Washington. We do tend to get earlier season apples and have apples that are a little bit fresher. If you're buying your apple in the grocery store right now, it's probably been picked a few weeks ago. But if you're buying your apple in the grocery store in July or August, then you are probably getting that apple that was picked in the previous season, and that apple is going to be 8 or 9 months old. So it just depends on what time of year you're buying. Are you seeing lands farther north being considered for apple farming now as opposed to the past? No, actually, I haven't really seen anything farther north. Most of the production has actually moved farther east in Washington state as it's kind of moved into the Columbia Basin area, where a lot of new irrigation has opened up. Um, but we'll see with climate changes as more places maybe become hospitable for apple growing, we might see that change. What about the growing hard cider market for Washington apples? Also a great question. I don't know a lot about the current hard cider market. I love hard cider. I'm glad to see that it's growing. Part of the challenge with ciders is that the apples that we grow for eating don't always make the best ciders. A lot of the apples that were used historically for cider had a lot of tannins. And so they could be fermented and come out a little bit more like a wine and have a little bit more that complex tannic flavor. Um, the apples used historically for cider would not be good to eat raw. Um, but the ones that we grow for eating have a very high sugar content. And so they do have to add yeast and other things to kind of make it work, um, which leads to a delicious product, but a different kind of product than what people might have tasted historically. Yeah, Jean.
Me again. Hey, we went to on Alaska, they have an Apple Fest every year. And this year they had home home farms like tours. And there was a guy who grows a huge variety of apples, and a lot of them are cider. So, like you're saying, they really don't taste very good at all. But there was a little cider making place that was very close by, so they work hand in hand. And if anybody wants to go to Alaska in October next year, it's really fun.
Oh, that sounds amazing.
Yeah,
And I bet
yeah.
it's delicious cider. I just reviewed a book on a written by a woman who used to produce ciders in Virginia from heirloom apples, and I was just making my mouth water, describing all of the different flavors and aromas and everything that she could get out of those heirloom apples that was a lot more complex than what she could get out of eating apples. Well, I know we're over our hour, so unless anyone has any last questions, thank you all so much for coming.